Welcome everyone. I'm Angela Goddard, the Director of Griffith University Art Museum. I'd like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we gather this afternoon, the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people who are here with us today. I've got the great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Jones, who has curated this wonderful exhibition for us, Cognitive Dissidents, Reasons to be Cheerful. We're really fortunate to have had the benefit of Stephen's expertise, not only in putting together this exhibition, which has been the process of a couple of years of conversations now, but Stephen has also been working with us over a number of years actually in terms of consulting with us and doing some of the work of digitising our very significant collection of early Australian video art and all of the issues and discussions that come out of those conversations about this material. So perhaps you'd all like to welcome Stephen, and I'll hand over to Stephen for our tour.
Can you hear me now without the microphone?
I think it's easier with the...
I know, I just want to make sure that if I drop it, put it down and forget that I've got it.
I'll remind you.
That you can hear me still. Yeah, all right. God, where did this start? Well, I suppose it started out of the project to preserve basically the history of electronic art in Australia. That's why I'm wondering whether, because I'm going to use this as a gestural instrument. That's where it all started. I come out of provision of technical support for galleries and artists from going back to 1976. So I have done a great deal of looking after people's works and all of that. And then in 1998, it occurred to me that if somebody doesn't save the history of video art, there isn't going to be a history of video art in terms of the actual works, because the tapes are starting to disintegrate at that point. So that led me into figuring out how to do that. It also meant that I actually had to go back and find all the old machines that I used to use many years previously, and pull them together and so on, and that led to being able to digitise people's works, and so in a sense I'm the backup store for a great deal of video art in the country, probably about 50% of the actual history of video art in Australia. Griffith Collection is incredibly significant because, for one, it is probably the most important collection of video art in the country. It's certainly the broadest and widest range of work, and it's been developed since the Film and Drama Centre back in 1976. And so that is really that's a significant achievement, frankly. And so I don't quite know how it all happened, but somewhere along the line we connected, and I started digitising their collection because we have to maintain the history and the materials, because otherwise they're just not going to be there to see. The machines, the old tape players are all slowly breaking apart, and also the tapes themselves are basically stripping the oxides off the tapes so that they don't actually have any future anyway, physically. So by digitising them, despite the fact that it does, in a sense, make quite a difference to the format, the appearance of some of the works, we at least are able to see most of it still. So what we've got here is a kind of look at the history of video art and the streams of video art that have developed in Australia. They come out of two fields in the long term back around 1970. Canadians had developed a process, a project called Challenge for Change, which amounted to providing video facilities to community activists in various cities in Canada, especially working class districts and districts of Indigenous lands and so on, so that they could actually communicate with them or put together pieces of video that allowed them to communicate to the bureaucracies that they were working with, and that was adopted. The news of that, the knowledge of that, came through a magazine called Radical Software, and that was became available in Melbourne first, and then Sydney in about 1970-71, and that led a bunch of people in Australia to think about the same thing, about using video to make activist, politically activist stuff. Now there's none of that very early work in this show, but there is some reasonably early work. The other aspect of it is that there was a great deal of interest at that stage, and quite a lot of development of electronic music, and people were looking for ways of representing visually electronic music. This is a synesthetic exploration. And at that stage, of course, everybody was taking LSD, and synesthesia was a kind of fairly normal experience. So people knew what that was and why. And so you'll see in here a couple of pieces where that's the sort of the kind of line, or the line of development that has taken place. So the very first work that is in this show from any of that work, but the other side of it, I've left another stream out. Experimental filmmaking was also really important in the late 60s and early 70s, and then the filmmakers co-ops in Melbourne and Sydney developed, and then there was the National Film Theatre, which also took an interesting work around, and of course there was a lot of interest in what was being made in Australia by experimental filmmakers, particularly Ubu Films. And then there was a lot of interest in a lot of sort of very interesting experimental film from west coast of America, and then some from the east coast of the US as well. And so that we're talking people like the Whitneys and so on. With all of that's a slightly bigger story, which I won't sort of, it's a rabbit hole we won't follow down. So. But anyway, so the synesthetic work, so in a sense what this show is about is the activist and the synesthetic. So it's about the electronic visual experience or visual display and its processes, and about the activist process, getting and expressing political ideas and how they may be dealt with. And then there's a little bit where the two sort of merge. Anyway, just to quickly go through the order, or in a sense the historical order of the show, the video on this monitor here, which of course right at the moment you can't see because you're all standing in the wrong place, and I can't spin the monitors around for you, is made by David Perry. And it's called Album, and though it's been included in a video show, it was actually made on film, but there's a heck of a lot of video in it that was then transferred in those days, because the only way you could actually store visual material at this point was on film rather than or colour visual material was on film and not on tape. Tape comes in this was made in 1970, so tape comes in just within a year or two after that. And David Perry was also quite involved in bringing tape into the experimental film world in that stage. So that's the first work. The second work, which is a bit more of the synesthetic view, is the work by Bush Video called Meta Video Programming. and there was a whole understanding of the way we were, how do I put it, in a sense, our consciousnesses are constructed by the way that the kind of view or the interaction and the relationships we have with various aspects of the world. And what this was about was stripping down that to a particular single process, which is, I usually use the term a feedback process, and the feedback is what happens in a conversation. So our conversation with the world, not just between you and me, but our conversation with the world in terms of our capacity to walk on the floor, our knowledge of the space and of the space of the rest of the world, our conversation with the world in terms of our relationship to it as an ecology or as a political community or just an ordinary community. All of these sorts of things are driven by, or have at the base of them, if you know, sort of filter it all down, this process of feedback. And feedback involves, in electronic forms, in video, pointing the camera at the monitor and then taking the output of the camera and feeding it into the monitor so that you have a loop. And if you look at, this is made up of a combination of things. This is made up of computer-generated Lissajous figures and of feedback, which are then streaming off the Lissajous figures. So the Lissajous figures provide the stimulus to drive the feedback and pattern the feedback. Then the colour was added as a secondary process because they had access to some very recent, in those days, very recently produced equipment, which sort of worked. It didn't work perfectly, unfortunately, but which is why the colour falls apart every now and then on the top of the picture. This one over here, the Frank Osvar, is another approach to the notion of the Lissajous. This is actually Osvar's, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's an indication of his respect for John Cage, the composer, American composer, who probably did more to alter the nature of music or of classical music and its contemporary manifestation of anybody. And so Cage had this aphorism, which is actually what's driving this. As you can see, it's a homage to Cage. His aphorism was, "I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it." So what Osvar does is that he just repeats that, and it's treated by slowing it down so that it's just really just the single syllables kind of, you know, and then he starts to speak again at the normal speed, and then it gets really fast and he's saying it. And so all of the figure, what you see on the screen, is the actual stereo microphones going into an oscilloscope and picking up and displaying how the sound waves, the actual waves of the vibration of the sound will mix together and form these what are called Lissajous figures, which are basically just taking two audio signals and feeding them into the X and Y inputs of an oscilloscope. X is the vertical, Y is the horizontal, and you then sum them together and you get this circular or so on. And so in this one, you can see the actual, when I first talked about it, we were looking at the ABC logo, which is actually a Lissajous figure of exactly, it's a 3 to 2 Lissajous figure. So there's 3 sine waves in Y and 2 in X, and that makes this form on the screen. And then the rest of these are very early computer graphics. There was the first functional, artistically accessible computer graphics system turned up in Sydney in 1972. It was being built in 72. It was sort of functional by late 72, early 73. There was a group of people, and this is where the activist and the experimental start to show their two forms coming out of this group of people, called Bush Video. Bush Video was established originally to create a communications centre during the Nimbin Aquarius Festival in 1973. Now, some of you might just have been there, but I don't know, I doubt it probably. I was, but I'm I was a maverick. So at Nimbin they established what they called a media communications centre, and what they had was that they got a hold of 3 or 4 quarter packs, and they would give them to the people at the festival, or they went out themselves and they would record stuff that was happening around the festival. So there's everything from the concerts and stuff like that to people swimming in the pool to the use of the very interesting shower system that was built by a radical architect of the time, whose name was it Bill Lucas? I can't remember now which one it was. And of course the township and people in the township and all of that sort of stuff. And so that Bush Video was assembled to do that, and then when Nimbin finished and they came back to Sydney, they kind of got hold of a studio space, just a warehouse floor in a warehouse, because warehouse floors were pretty available in those days, and built a studio, and then they started making all of this really interesting experimental electronic-based stuff and things like that, as well as continuing to record people's shows and performances and do theatre stuff and dance stuff and things like that. So that's where it happens. And then what I'm getting at is that in that room, we're looking at the long-term results of the community activist kind of approach to making video. In this room, we're looking at the more internally self-reflective processes that were involved. And so basically the reason for the sort of notion of the feedback is that it is actually a system reflecting on itself. And what we understood that to mean in that period, 73 to subsequent, was that was what a conscious living system did, is that it reflected upon itself, and that's why that was how it became conscious of itself and would be able to be conscious of other things. So there was this sort of philosophical layer inside all of this sort of stuff that was going on. Anyway, so we spent too much time on that, but you'll see that that whole notion of being able to reflect on one's experience and one's place in the world and one's processes in the world is how this whole thing is driven, this show is driven, and it's the activist aspect of it, that one's reflection on the politics of the world, and the electronic and artistic aspect of it, which is the reflection upon one's thinking about individual parts of the world and representing them in various sorts of manners. So Linda Wallace actually is much later, but she's looking at how her notions of, or how her use of the computing capability allowed her to develop communication systems with other people that were really radically different from anything that had normally been available through you know, the older days of telephone and letter writing and things like that. And so that's a really quite an early approach to representing how the new computer mediated interaction would manifest. And you know, there's bits of it that are sort of quite radical, very radical in their own way. Now, we think we get into the more personal thing here. This is a Marilyn Fairskye work where she's just been looking at lots and lots of people that she has had various kinds of interactions with over the years in various countries, and has taken their photograph. And then she's just showing you each of those people. So it's a fairly simple work with you know, but if you look at the range of people that have been in there and so on, it actually has quite a lot of depth to it. This is a very, very personal work. This is a work by Francesca Dorini and Josephine Stars, and it's about Francesca's mother and her what I can't really put it in polite terms. It's about her disintegration, it's a very, very moving work, which I think really, I mean, that's one work that really needs to have a good look at. On this side, we're getting back into the more electronic. Most of you will have heard the term MRI, which is basically magnetic resonance imaging. It's a way of looking at human bodies or biological stuff of any kind, but particularly human bodies, and seeing how they actually can, what happens. And what it does is that it shakes up the hydrogen atoms in molecules, and then they radiate essentially sonic waveforms pretty much, and it looks at those and each one of those slices that you can see there is so it's a medical imaging device, and that Justine Cooper's work is a really excellent summary of the process and what it is, and the sounds are quite remarkable, because the sounds are actually the machine working around the person who's been probably Justine, I don't know whose body it is, but it's it's probably Justine Cooper's.
Yeah, it's her own. It's her body.
Sorry?
It's her body.
It is her body, right, yeah. Okay. This is a Peter Callis work. Peter was a performance video artist in the beginning, in his beginnings, and then discovered electronic manipulation of video that was starting to become available originally through the Fairlight CVI, and then through several much more sophisticated systems that he had access to in Japan. Fairlight CVI originated in Australia, and it was a machine that allowed you to store a frame of video in real time, so it would store one frame, in a continuous process. And then you could manipulate the contents of those frames by pushing them, making them move, wobble and stuff like that, by changing the count, the access of the start point of each line that you're accessing and things like that. Anyway, there's lots of technical stuff which is probably a bit much for this particular conversation. So what he's done here is that he's used a variety of these machines, and what he's looking at is how Europeans took over the knowledge of the world in maybe the 12th century or thereabouts, often probably even well earlier, from Eastern people. The Europeans, particularly the English, captured a great deal of the maps and things like that, and then that other people had already been drawing, and they started to then use those to build up their empire across the planet. And the real manifestations, of course, are in the 16th and 17th century when they sent the ships out, and eventually in the 18th century when they found Australia and so on. And claimed Australia, which of course is completely illegal behaviour, but brings us to this, actually, because this is Ree's poles apart, and of course we are the two cultures poles apart. This is her reflection on her mother's and aunt's and their family's separation, or what's the word, when, you know, I can't remember.
Kidnapping.
Sorry?
Kidnapping.
Well, no, they were kidnapped, yes, but it was more, you know, the whole colonial business of separating out the Aboriginal, the stolen generation separated out, aren't they? Yeah, sorry. and you know, so this is her reflection on the fact that her mother and aunts were of the stolen generation. And so that's what she's doing here. She's being somebody or acting out the kind of role of somebody who is escaping with the accoutrement of having been a maid in a rich English gentleman's autocracy home, and is now being hunted, you know, and so she's aware of and watching out for the people who are chasing her and stuff like that. And so that's a really important work, and that's very much an activist process, the work that's going on. So we've sort of gone from this electronic stuff, and if we would like to trip around inside, I've left one piece out, Warren Burt. Warren Burt is a user of video synthesizers. He's an electronic music composer. He takes the electronic music and he manifests that as visual things as well, as visual screen, you know, images and moving images that move with the music. And so this is directly built from the use of electronic music in manipulating video signals and colouring them and forming them and things like that. So he's actually an American, but he came out here in 1975 to teach music at La Trobe University. Yes, and his boss was Keith Humble, who's another very important Australian composer, and they bought an English machine called the Spectre, which was the first video synthesizer in the country, despite the fact that the Sydney University people, Doug Richardson, who built the computer generated imaging system that's on that screen, the Bush video piece, was by that stage already functioning, so they should have looked at that. But computing and analog were not of the same class in those days. They are much more these days. Well, I guess all the analogs become digitised. So anyway, march this way. So all Right, so again, this piece, my memory for names is so bad. Warwick Thornton. Payback is a very, I mean, it's a wonderful piece. It's an extraordinary thing, but it's about Aboriginal internal to the culture, Aboriginal mechanisms of punishment and forgiveness and so on, so that you accept a payback, you undergo a payback, and you then are cleared of the guilt for whatever it was that you did. So this is a film-driven, originated thing, though I believe it was cut in video, because there's a number of pieces where it's clearly got visual mixes and things like that in it. It's a really important piece, just both in terms of current film culture and in terms of of the way, of Aboriginal Indigenous culture. So I put them, in a sense, back to back on the two walls because I thought they really deserved the kind of making them so much more extensive and expanded than a lot of the other pieces. Obviously they're bigger and things like that, but it's just, I thought they would be the ones that should have that sort of respect attached to them. Now this is another work by about colonialism, English colonialism in Australia. It's about the squattocracy and stuff like that. It's the effect of that within Western Australia. It's a Joan Brazel work. Joan Brazel is the first woman video artist in Australia, I think. She would give June Pritchard a good run for her money. Anyway, they were both working at the Mount at the same time. But she's looking at the impact of Western or English agricultural culture on the original land and the landscape and how it's affected it and what's been left, what the relics or leftovers are and all of that sort of stuff. And so it's a long, piece, and the sound is really worth listening to because the sound was actually produced by a man called Alan Lamb, and what he does is that he goes to where there's a very long telephone wire between the poles along the old telegraph wires and things like that. And of course the telegraph was the main means of, the telegraph was the 19th century internet basically, but that's probably not the point they're trying to make. He, in a sense, bangs the wire, and the sound, or the impact echo runs up the wire and back. And of course the speed with which it does so, because it is quite quick, I mean it makes beautiful, beautiful sound. And so the sound all comes from that process. It's the actual the sound going down and then reflecting back into the source, and echoing and echoing and echoing and echoing up and down the wire. Meanwhile, all of this landscape stuff and the detail of the landscape is dissolved over the actual wider shots of the landscape and things like that, and the detail of some of the things within the landscape, the small bits of seeds and so on. Anyway, so I just had to speed it up. June Pritchard and Luce Pellissier. June Pritchard was the boss of the Paddington Video Access Centre. She was the manager of the Paddington Video Access Centre in 1974 to 78. In the process, she was heavily, the Paddington Video Access Centre was heavily involved with feminist stuff because, of course, it was in a city, whereas the other access centres were out in the western suburbs, and they were involved with immigration issues, people's, the whole issue of how people become integrated into societies when they come from other kinds of cultures and things like that. Whereas in a city, it was more about more directly political issues. So she came up to Queensland when Joe Bjelke-Petersen was running a show here, and he was essentially running a show, and he made did a whole lot of segments on different parts of the activism that was engaged, that was trying to deal with Bjelke-Petersen and criticise him and stop the insanity or the massive corruption that he was engaged in. This is a piece by Deb Beattie, who is one of the over here, and it's another reflection on the role of Joe. And there's a wonderful it's not an imitation, it's by Jerry Connolly, impersonation of Joe in there, and of course, it's all about what Joe was doing and so on. And of course, all of this along the actual walkway here along the riverside is curiously the most positive side of what Joe was doing.
A lot of that had to do with Wayne Foss.
Was it? Oh, it was all after. Okay. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure of the timing of all of that, but yeah. Anyway, this is about Expo 88 and how South Bank was going to be cleared and turned into a massive entertainment venue, basically. I'm sorry, things are going to have to. This is a beautiful work. John Conomos, Greek, Australian, largely a philosopher, but a philosopher in video. His writing is more about his making rather than about actual writing text. And it's about the sublime. And so it's looking at the philosophical notion, the postmodern philosophical notion of the sublime, and how that is manifested within contemporary culture of the time. From the rocket to the Mars to to the landscape, to Lake George, which is the long green piece that appears every now and then in there. So there's two more to go. I'm going to go across here to D. Void. Michelle Mara. There's a group of men in Sydney called Gravity Feed, who are, or they were, they're not there anymore. They're still around, but they're not working as a group anymore. Who did very, very radical dance performances, and they're all really quite wonderful things. And what Michelle has done is that it was made for SBS, this piece, for a series that they were doing on new media stuff in '95. It's really a piece of where what she's done is that she's just stripped it right back to the totally white background and just the movements, and the men in their movements with and so that's the black suits and the hair and things, and it's been and you can see that their dance is really quite different from any other class of dance that people would normally relate to or understand and so on. So there's that. And then there's this piece here, which is by a group of sound poets called R. And this is made quite a long time ago. I can't remember the date now. But it was largely shot on film, but it was edited and finished on video because it was there's lots of dissolves and layering and things like that. And it's very hard to do that, or very expensive to do that in film. And so, and basically it's a piece where they perform, where the poetry is performative as well as just read, so they don't just sit there and read the poet or stand there and read the stuff. They actually get up there and it's all much more about that performance of things. So, she's making, and the sounds are broken down into phonemes almost rather than actual words, so that they make, it becomes like a long, in some ways, the moments of it are a long stutter more than an actual sound or complete word or something like that. And so I think we've pretty much covered it. Hopefully. Questions? Have I made sense?
Yes, good.
Just,
Yeah.
so you're basically going along and you're getting all this footage that other people have and you're putting it down in a national database now. So is that going to be released to the public, or is it just something that...
No, everything is copyright the artist. So I can't release it to anybody other than without a piece of paper from the artist saying, please give this a copy of this to said person, No, copyright is essential because...
I understand that. I was just wondering if it's available online in
No,
place.
it will probably not be online, simply because it's not my material. I'm just I'm just the server, so to speak. Or my facility is just the server. So I just do the digitising and make it look as good as I can possibly get off it.
But you've written a book and you're writing.
Oh, I've written one book and I'm writing another book. But so there's lots of history, and there's lots of pictures and there's lots of discussion of the works, and a largely what I've just said is a kind of part of that. In almost as extracted from that.
So it's available in libraries.
Well, if you like, we found a copy in the library here, which was I was very surprised about.
But I mean, the copyright thing is interesting though, isn't it? I think that has to progress that conversation because, well, I mean, online you can see reproductions of paintings and,
If the artist wants to get the digitisation I've done and then put it out, of course they can do that. I'm not going to stop them. That's not what my job is. My role is. My role is just to be the backup. In this instance, in this situation, I'm just the backup. If you want to take that work and put it up on Facebook or on YouTube, then please go for it. That's fine because it's your work. But if it's not my work, so I can't do that.
You can see Devoid pretty easily on YouTube, so some of these works are pretty easy to find.
Mine's in the State Library.
And
Online.
Well, you see, the problem with the State Library, I don't know what the State Library is, but I know with a lot of the libraries, it's almost impossible to see the works in them.
Oh no, SLQ is pretty good.
Oh, well, that's good. That's a very different situation, because if you try and look at something in the National Library, you've got weeks of bloody work.
They've got a great collection.
And you can stay from home. Or view it from home. Yes.
Easy.
But I won't personally put any of your work, or other than my work, any work up other than my own work online, because I don't own it. I have no right to do so, and I observe that strictly.
I'm interested about the artists. So
they're doing visual and audio art.
A lot of them,
Yeah,
yes.
they're doing the
Yeah.
both mediums together, not
yeah.
having a separate person doing that.
No, a lot of them, I mean, sometimes they use different people, sometimes it's collaboration, but quite often it's actually the same person doing the work, doing both sounds, both sides. But, I mean, the sound is crucial. Even the silence on some works is crucial. Like on Poles Apart, there's no sound with that. But that silence of the bush, of the landscape, especially in pre-colonial, pre-European times, is really an important thing. So I think anyway.
Any other questions? Oh well, perhaps you could hang around and chat to Steve. I've got one other question. The blue. Not the blue.
The blue.
It's very odd for a video show to not be a black box in many ways. So Stephen, can you talk to us about this
Why was the blue?
blue?
I've got no.
Very
Does it have something to do with the cheerful title, maybe?
Well,
There's a
yeah, there's that too. Yeah, I mean, it's out of the blue. It's blue sky thinking. All of those sorts of things. I don't know. I think it was that I actually wanted to see the sky, the blue of the sky, and I wanted it to open up so that you were in a much, or potentially, much more. I mean, we don't even more light on it, but it's really hard to not interfere with the screens, unfortunately. But no, it was to bring the sky into the room was really what I was trying to do.
I did have a question, now that you mentioned the title, I've forgotten the title. Cognitive Dissidents. Did you consciously make, and obviously you're playing of
Oh yeah,
cognitive
no,
dissonance,
it's a
and
phrase
I just wondered how far you went,
I was.
how far you were going.
You'll be horrified given my age. I was having a joint with a friend, and we were having a very wild conversation, and I came up with the term cognitive dissidents because I thought that describes what the people that I work with are. They are cognitive dissidents. We are dissident thinkers about matters of cognitive issues, cognitive importance, cognitive involvement in the world. Our cognition, our knowledge of the world is dissident in comparison to the average, Morrison and his mates kind of
Well, that's why I was asking, because I guess, I just wondered how far you went, and you're kind of in that territory of what I was interested in, with cognitive dissidents, and then you might get viewers who are full of cognitive dissonance.
dissonance.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
because
I mean,
it can be very confronting.
there's room for the play on that because obviously most people will kind of say cognitive dissonance when they just glance at the thing and they don't, but I was very particular that I wanted the term dissidents, not dissonance.
Oh yes.
Because we don't want, what we're actually trying to do is to not be dissonant, but to actually be dissident about the terrible things that are being done, particularly in the climate, which at the time, other things have risen recently which make it even worse. Not the climate, but social relations of varying kinds. And I wanted to bring the notion of the dissident to the fore, because it's the dissident who brings out the new ways of thinking and the new approaches or different approaches that allow us to actually get to climb out of the kind of situation that we're in now.
Yes, that's what I
makes sense.
because this is a retrospective
This is a
show,
retrospective.
so these are being received in a very different way to
Yeah.
how they would have been initially. And I was just wondering how Anyway, I think you've answered my question.
Okay.
That you're conscious of that.
Yeah, well, you know,
separation.
you know, there's a lot. I think a lot of, I have over the years done a lot of work on the notion of what consciousness is, and so I'm very interested in that, which is why feedback is a major part of it, and things like that, and why I talked about feedback and conversation in the other room, and so you know, but it's the notion that cognitive means about knowledge, and dissident means different ways of thinking about knowledge. So that's what
I could have made it to Mindy, by the way. But I think that video in a way sums it up. I wasn't quite ready for the rabbit hole.
Sorry.
I wasn't quite ready for those sort of experiences.
Okay, good.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for your dissidence. And I suppose, you know, perhaps everybody in this room would like to think of ourselves in some ways as
Well, I'm sure most of us do have
being in
some
that
kind of level
realm.
of dissidence.
Yeah, you know, after all, here we are on a Saturday afternoon to learn more and to expand our knowledge, and to not just simply receive. And, you know, that's kind of the interesting thing about feedback is it requires response. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you giving up your Saturday afternoon. If you would like to purchase a copy of the catalogue, it's for sale at the front desk for the very cheap price of $11. And we're about to launch a series of public programs to further work through some of the themes of the show and guest artists, etc. So we hope that you'll keep an eye on your socials and come along to some of our other programs. But thank you so much, and could you join with me in thanking Stephen?